Okay, we're going to start our first panel of this dialogue session. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're on meeting here on the on traditional Haudenosaunee and the Mississauga of New Credit First Nation. So this panel is entitled Framing the Issue. Now, I think our previous speakers have done a pretty good job of getting us started there, but we're going to try and provide an overview of the current financial relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples, and the challenges this creates for Indigenous governments, the resulting impact, and the rationale for being funded in a fashion similar to federal funding of provincial and territorial governments for core services. That's the kind of challenge we've set out for ourselves. My name is Scott Serson. I'm a retired federal public servant. I was for a time Deputy Minister of what was then Indian and Northern Affairs. And when I retired to pay for my many sins, I went to work with National Chief Phil Fontaine for 6 years. So that's my background. Our panelists are all in your agenda there, their CVs. So I'm just going to introduce them briefly. We're going to start with Harold Calla, who is the Executive Chair of the First Nations Financial Management Board. Then we'll turn to Howard Grant, who is Executive Director of the First Nations Summit in British Columbia. Then we'll hear from Wayne Waters, former clerk of the Privy Council of Canada and currently a strategic and policy advisor with McCarthy Tétrault. And last but certainly not least, we're going to hear from Paul Topel, who is the Chief Financial Officer at Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada. So Harold, do you like to lead off, please?
Good afternoon and thank you. I'm from the Squamish Nation in Vancouver. Came home in 1987 and I learned a lot in the last 30 years about these issues. And I'm reminded, as I think about these things, about one of the alleged quotes from Albert Einstein about defining insanity as being something you do over and over again and expect different results. And that's sometimes how I feel about these issues. Was really pleased to hear the regional chief's discussion this morning to us, talking about jurisdiction, talking about taxation, talking about financial management. These are the things that we started working on in 1987. In 97, we started developing legislation to create the Fiscal Management Act, which brought about the First Nations Financial Management Board, which I chair, the First Nation Tax Commission, and the First Nations Finance Authority, and you're going to hear from Ernie tomorrow. Because at the end of the day, we can have all of the talk about the right thing and all the emotional conversation, but as an accountant, I've become a bit jaded, I guess, the older I get, because it is, in my view, really all about the money. Why hasn't Canada responded in 150 years? It's all about the money. It's all about access to land and resources. It's all about generating wealth but not sharing it, or sharing very limited amounts of it. So when the Prime Minister started to talk about a nation-to-nation dialogue and a new fiscal relationship, I realized we had to go to the table. I was not sure what the outcome would be, but I was taught that when that table is set, you have to go. You have to engage. My worry was, could the Aboriginal community get itself organized? We should not be waiting for things to be tabled to us to consider. We need to develop the strategy in the paper, and we need to go to government and tell them this is what we want. In the late 80s, we thought we got self-government, we got self-administration. We're now talking about a government-to-government relationship, and what is that going to mean? Certainly, how your governments are resourced are a very important part of the conversation, and I know that the AFN is having some discussions about that today. And while that is an element of a fiscal relationship, in my view, is all about jurisdiction. Jurisdiction over your right to raise revenue out of your traditional territories. Jurisdiction to determine what the level of programs and services would be, what the standards should be. What this requires is clear jurisdiction between governments, and not just Aboriginal governments and the federal government, but all orders of government, including local government, regional districts, the province. And independent First Nation jurisdictions that are recognized. I'm tired of going into local governments, and I have the unfortunate circumstance of having to deal with 6 different municipalities in 3 different regional districts in my community's traditional territory, and going into those local governments and fighting the battles with them over the fact that they're unhappy that there's Indian reserves and Indians in their municipal boundaries. I like to tell them that they're in our traditional territory. And there's the philosophical difference between the settlers, as they're referred to here, and the Aboriginal people. So we need independent First Nation jurisdictions that are recognized that we don't have to fight for every time we engage in a conversation. We need to be self-sufficient and independent First Nations. Governments need to make tax room for First Nations. We need to raise our own revenues. We need to ensure that there's national standards and that transfers, which are going to be a part of all of our world, are there, and that there's an equalization plan for First Nation communities. We need institutions. You heard that several times today. I don't know what they're all going to be yet, and there have been some discussions and some suggestions that are coming out about an Auditor General, an Ombudsman, an infrastructure bank, all of these, and something to deal with housing. But we need institutional support. We need aggregation. We need to empower, at some level, an ability to gain a foothold in the negotiations with government, because we can't do it 634 times. There isn't enough capacity in our communities to do it. Some of us, our Howard and I community are in downtown Vancouver, and we have own source revenue, and we can. But we're one of a few. And so we need this institutional support. As I said before, we got frozen in time. We became a ward of the government. We weren't allowed to evolve or develop institutions. The institutions we had in place were forbidden, and they were not allowed to evolve. So we need to reconstitute our institutional. We need to be able to engage with government at a central agency level, with our own central agencies, because that's the only way we're going to be able to work with this government or any government that comes after it. The current fiscal arrangement doesn't meet any of these principles. And the results of that are poor services and infrastructure, insufficient independent revenues, little accountability for poor service and infrastructure quality, and little institution and capacity development support. The Auditor General spoke about the challenges with specific claims and all these other issues. When it comes to Indians, the value of consideration that we're given is based upon some innocuous formula that bears no relationship to cost or value. It's based on budget availability. How many people do we think? How are we going to allocate it? Really found that out when we were in court in specific claims for Vanier Park in downtown Vancouver. Oh, we can't give you that kind of money because we don't have it in the budget. And I thought, well, you go and tell a non-Aboriginal that you're expropriating their lands, that you can't pay them what the value of the land is because you don't have it in your budget. See how far that gets you. The current problem with the fiscal relationship is that it's a program. It's a program operated by a federal department that has obligations put upon it to be accountable and transparent for the use of those funds to Parliament. And its focus becomes that. There are no transparent formulas, unclear who has the real financial responsibility and administrative responsibility for services, no consequences for poor service, and does not encourage economic growth. Insufficient tax and fiscal powers. What it's done is create competition amongst the First Nations for the resources that the department has provided. And so it doesn't respond to any of our needs in the long term. And I liked Bob Ray's comments about needing to understand this. There's no quick fix to this. This is a 20 to 40 year program. It took us 10 years just to get the Fiscal Management Act passed. The other thing that I liked what he said is if we're going to systemically change the relationship, we can't do it with those who are currently involved in the existing structure controlling it. You can't ask the federal departments who have huge budgets as a result of providing services to, in effect, eat themselves. We need to move outside of that process. We need to be reporting directly to Parliament, and we need to be at those tables. And I think that's the problem that I see with the existing relationship. We're not. And too often we're spoken about in the third person. Policies get developed that are consistent with the federal government objectives, but not ours. And so that has to change, but we have to change it. There's no point in getting mad at Paul, because Paul's not the problem. We're the problem, because we're not prepared en masse to come forward. And so government picks us off one by one to the lowest common denominator, and we have to change that. We have to have the confidence to change that. And the new fiscal relationship creates the opportunity for us to start to come together. I can tell you, when we started talking about the Fiscal Management Act, I'd have never heard a regional chief of Ontario talk about tax. We tried once, 20 years ago. And we've now begun to look at these kinds of things as government revenues, not an exemption. And that's where we have to start. The other biggest problem with the existing relationship is the programs and services that we provide are subject to the discretion of other orders of government. And that has to change. One of the questions that we were given is, how does the new fiscal relationship get rebased because of the 2% cap? And I looked at the question and I thought, boy, do we really want to open a can of worms about a budget process, parliamentary budget process, that we're going to have to lobby for to get what we need, what we should be entitled to? And we may have to do something in the beginning, but it is not the place to start if you have a vision for what you want in the future. What do we want to see in 20 years? I've often asked that of parliamentary committees that I go before and say, what do you want this file to look like in 20 years? So we have to have the courage and the vision and the wisdom to not rush, the wisdom to understand that not all of our communities have the capacity that they need to even engage in these kinds of conversations today. There's 217 First Nations across Canada scheduled to the Fiscal Management Act, and we're dealing with about 120 of them right now. Building their capacity, getting to understand what some of these things are, moving to process-based decision-making models from a personality-based decision-making model. We need to encourage service innovation through this aggregation approach. And in some cases, we're not going to get everything we want as a First Nation. We've so embraced the Indian Act band mentality that we have forgotten that we were nations. Just because a sector of our nation's community lived in a location and the Indian agent came along and said, "You're an Indian band," 634 times. We were nations, and we need to remember that at times and understand that the Indian Act is actually the albatross around our neck. Certainly we need data. We need information. And we actually had a Stats Institute originally. The Fiscal Management Act was originally called the Fiscal and Statistical Management Act. And our goal at that time was to have data that we could go to the table with in the fiscal financing negotiations that would occur from time to time. That was another thing that Conservatives didn't like and got rid of. I think we have to start telling people in this country what we contribute to this country, what we've contributed in the past, but more importantly, what we're going to contribute in the future. The emerging law around our Aboriginal rights and title as it coming out of the Supreme Court in Canada now have a significant impact on the Canadian economy. I had a major bank in this country, the fellow that was in charge of infrastructure, going down to Texas to speak to TransCanada to tell them he didn't think he'd be able to raise the money for their Kinder Morgan project. Investors wouldn't give him the money because they didn't want to risk there not being Aboriginal consent. Now somebody will give them the money somewhere. They'll never not get the money, but it was astounding to me that a major bank, someone at that level, would come in and acknowledge that Aboriginal rights and title were now so significant in their minds that they would have to see some verification of First Nation buy-in to that. I think we're all starting from a different place. There's pre-Confederation treaties, numbered treaties, modern-day treaties. I come from unceded traditional territory. We don't have a treaty. And as I am now likely to say when I come east, you've taught me a lot about treaty, and I don't want one. I don't want one under the terms that they're coming, because it's about extinguishment. In these self-government and treaty negotiations, I always remember what one of our elders said when I went in and talked about what was on the table in the negotiation. And he turned to me and he said, "Harold, treaty making isn't about what we're getting. It's about what we're giving up." My ancestors did not extinguish any of my Aboriginal rights and title. I don't know if any generation has the right to do that. I continue to ask why Aboriginal rights and title can't live in perpetuity in the way that it was originally described by some of the conversation this morning. Shouldn't be extinguished, and we should not put ourselves in that position that it's extinguished. We need to be in a position where we're exercising jurisdiction. And that's what a nation-to-nation and a government-to-government relationship is. It's not about redefining programs that are being administered by somebody else. And so I think tremendous opportunity that we have. This dialogue series is starting to bring awareness across the country in many communities, many different sectors of our society about what the issue is, or the issues. The reality is Canada is a better place if they resolve these matters. Where are we going to spend the wealth? In our communities. It's not going to Holland or to Hong Kong, it's staying here. One of the things that Canada needs to step up to the plate and acknowledge is because they did not allow us to evolve, because our systems of governance and our abilities to generate economies were taken away, we don't have the wealth. The scale of economic activity is now so large that there's no opportunity. Economic development is as important as having a gas station is and having a grocery store. Economic development as a government and taking our Aboriginal rights and title means that we're involved in the billions of dollars of businesses that are going around. And how do we get that equity? What elements of the Federation's infrastructure should First Nations be able to avail themselves to? And I say it's Canada's balance sheet. For particularly major projects, the fiscal relationship needs to anticipate that federal loan guarantees will be on the table. That sends shivers down everybody's spine. Great Britain did the same thing in 2008, not for their Indigenous population, but they created a £50 billion trust fund for federal loan guarantees to support certain types of developments, infrastructure, schools, those kinds of things. There's policy work that can be done. But Ernie will talk about the cost of capital tomorrow, and we need to understand that money is no different than a 2x4 or a hammer. It's a commodity that you go out and get. And in many cases, because of the Indian Act, we don't have the ability to access capital, except at very exorbitant rates. 15 communities negotiated a Pacific Trails pipeline, natural gas pipeline that was going to run to the coast. When they went out to get the $300 million that they were asked to go and get, the banks wanted 11.25%. There was no return. So access to capital is a big issue, and I'm glad it was raised today, because it's often not understood that part of a fiscal relationship that we have to develop, and one that is substantially different than one we operate in today, is ensuring that we have access to capital. So I will close by saying, great opportunity. Those of us who come from communities, let's go home and talk to them. Let's get them to the point where they're prepared to engage. And let's get ourselves organized so that we can empower whoever's going to go to the tables to actually negotiate an arrangement. Legislation is the way to go. I know governments come and go and they can change it, but it's a lot more difficult to change legislation than it is policy. Thank you very much.